I'm pleased to have with us today Maia Cucchiara, professor of education at Temple, who's going to be talking about some of her work on parenting education programs. I also want to preview next week. We have Jacob Farber, who's a professor at NYU, and we'll be talking about the New Deal era interventions in America's racial geography. So that should be a great talk as well. She has said that she will take questions as we go, so please feel free to raise your hand.
Yes, definitely.
And ask her.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have this amazing view. And I've not ever been to the University of Wisconsin before, and it's just great to be in a place where so much really good work that I've respected for so many years has come from. So the title of my talk is I Just Need a Job: Behavioral Solutions, Structural Problems, and the Hidden Curriculum of Parenting Education. And before I go any further, I should say that the research on which this is based was funded by a National Academy of Education Spencer postdoctoral fellowship. And I did the data collection, but worked collaboratively with two graduate students on the data analysis, which was just incredibly helpful. Okay, so parenting education is a very popular intervention. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people go to parenting class of some sort or another. Classes are offered in social service agencies, schools, prisons, community centers, and then of course there's home visiting that happens, another form of parenting education. And it's hard to get an exact calculation of how much money is spent every year on parenting education, but some of the estimates that I found suggested it was like several $100 million a year. So this is a big, big intervention. While not all parenting education programs are for low-income parents, mostly they are, and certainly the ones that have been the focus of a lot of research are for families with children who are at risk, right? Children who are at risk of abuse, neglect, school failure, other kind of negative outcomes associated with growing up in poverty. And these classes are really informed by an ample research that talks about class differences in parenting, right, which I'm sure folks are familiar with. So, for example, evidence that low-income parents, especially poor parents, are more likely to use kind of punitive discipline, less likely to talk extensively with their children, to engage, to play, less likely to provide kind of warm, attachment-y parenting. So these programs are basically trying to say, all right, if we know this is happening, we can try to improve children's outcomes by changing what goes on in the homes, and that this will ultimately lead to, children doing better in school, less, lower rates of dropout, lower rates of incarceration, whatever. So that's the kind of assumption underlying these programs. And while there's a lot of variation, and I don't think we can sort of put every parenting program in a box, in general, they aim to kind of to strengthen positive parenting. So, for example, to reduce harsh discipline, to increase parental warmth and engagement, and to increase the kind of interactions between parents and children that could promote cognitive development. So that's the goal of these programs. The research, however, has shown that the effects are not as promising as proponents would have hoped, right? And Catherine has done some work on this. So, for instance, parents engaged in these programs, and again, there's lots of different ones, so it's kind of hard to draw conclusions. Yeah?
It's two-gen programs for sure, but is it also aimed at really just young children? Is that what you're looking at?
Right.
So you're not looking at teaching people who didn't do well in school how to go to school and argue for your kid and stuff like that.
No.
So it's essentially two-gen, early, under age 5. That's
Yeah.
Just like focus on.
Yeah, it's two-gen, but the programs that I'm studying didn't actually have a preschool component per se, right? So it's the parents, and it's focusing on the parents, not actually addressing the kids' needs.
Right.
Yeah, please.
Well, but I think the other distinction, Tim, is 2Gen, I think now refers to doing human capital for parents. So some sort of job training or education.
Right.
So it's not parents getting education, it's education to make parents better parents.
Yes.
Regardless of whether or not, like, early Head Start often has a center component to it, but many of them are straight up just come learn how to be a better parent with
exactly.
no other component.
Yeah, yeah. And they're not always for parents of younger children, but that's where most of the research has been directed, and that's most common.
Folks, that's it.
What's that?
Just focusing.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the research shows that the parents are somewhat more likely to engage more and to use less harsh discipline, but the effects are small, and then when it comes to the kids, the effects are really small, and they tend to kind of disappear over time. So the big exception is home visiting programs that involve really highly trained nurses that go out to people's homes and do kind of sustained work with them. Those have been shown to have a stronger impact, but that's not what I'm studying here, although I did do some work with those programs. So when I was getting into this topic, I was really struck by the fact that most research on parenting education is very individual focused. So it was, the extent to which individual parents had changes in their behavior or attitudes, individual changes in behaviors and attitudes. So there would be an outcome that the program was trying to achieve, and they'd measure the extent to which a parent achieved that outcome. There wasn't very much in the literature on the context of mothers' lives, because most of the participants are mothers. Not much on the context of their lives, like what's actually going on with them. And also, there wasn't very much, except for some really great work by scholars in the United Kingdom and Canada, that was looking at what are some of the assumptions about poor people, about poor parents, that are informing these kind of poverty interventions. So that's where I was coming into this. And my study, I'm an ethnographer, so I was coming from the sort of assumption, the premise that to really understand these programs, to understand why the outcomes have been so spotty, we need to think more about how parents themselves experience them. So more broadly, I'm informed by my own training as a sociologist. So I want to treat parenting, and particularly ideas about what counts as good parenting, as contextualized, right? And socially and historically contingent. So what counts as a good parent now is not the same as what counted as a good parent 50 years ago. We can't assume there's one definition. I also wanted to place the kind of programs that I was looking at within a larger understanding of the ways in which social policy in the United States has defined the problem and the possible solutions. And here, I'm heavily informed by Michael Katz's work. He was a mentor of mine, so I'm heavily informed by Michael Katz's work on the history of social policy. I also wanted to pay attention to the structural forces and the immediate context in which parents were living. So, what kind of things are they actually dealing with? And I was interested in the ways in which what's happening in the classes does or doesn't intersect with the parents' lives. And then, as an ethnographer, I'm focused on meaning making and experiences. So just quickly, the paper that I'm talking about here draws from research at 3 sites, and I'll give you a little more information about them in a minute. I did field work for 3 years, and that involved extensive participation in these classes. I would go every week. I would sit with the mothers. I would chat with them before and after. I also did interviews with the mothers and and the instructors, and a second round of interviews with as many of the mothers with whom I could still be in touch, because it was really hard to stay in touch with folks because numbers changed and all of that. What's that? 7. Yeah. But what I was trying to do with the interviews was both find out about the mothers' lives, find out about what they thought of the parenting class, and then in the second round go back and say, well, what do you think you got out of it? Now, I should say, I do not pretend that this is a study of the effects of parenting education. This is not a design that would let you say, oh, parenting education works or doesn't work. That's not my goal. My goal is to understand what's going on in these classes and the intersections with women's lives. So I can't speak to impact. I'm focusing on meaning making, not behavior change per se. All right, so let me give you a little bit of information about the 3 sites, and I'm happy to answer questions. In the paper, I had a really hard time with the short word count, with the limited word count, and all the information I wanted to share, trying to sort of explain where these sites were and what the differences were. So Morris High School is an alternative school. All these sites served low-income women, mostly African American and Latinx. So Morris was an alternative high school. The classes were once a week for an hour, and there was an on-site daycare at Morris. So the classes, they alternated. So 1 week, they would start for about a half an hour in the nursery with the kids, and the instructor, Mama Odette, would facilitate kind of activities with the kids, and then they would move upstairs to a classroom. And there was always some drama as the mothers were trying to, escape from, put their kids down and leave, and there'd always be this kind of extended drama about that. Because, babies and toddlers don't like to be left. And the instructor at Morris, I call Mama Odette. She was an African-American woman in her 50s. She had had 3 children, one of whom had severe special needs, and actually she had 4 because another one had died in her infancy. And Mama Odette was very maternal, as her name implies. She would tell the mothers she loved them. She would give them these fierce hugs, and she felt like she had been a poor mother, and so she could really connect with them. So that's Mama Odette at Morris. At Second Chance, this was a charter school, also for people who had dropped out. All students at Second Chance who had children were required to attend parenting class. Now, I think it's all students at Second Chance who were raising children, right? Because it was just mostly mothers in the class. And the classes met twice a week for 40 minutes each time. The instructor here was a woman I call Miss Naomi. She was young, African American in her 20s. She did not have children. She was an experienced sex ed instructor, so she had a lot of health kind of information, but she hadn't actually had children. So at Morris and Second Chance, they used these programs were both affiliated with a larger parenting education program, and they both used a curriculum that was meant to be research-based that program had designed. Mama Odette didn't really use the curriculum, but Miss Naomi did. And finally, the final site was I call Sutton Social Services. It was a social welfare agency. And at this class, the classes were once a week for 2 hours. So I got some really great extended data from there. It was mostly African-American mothers. All the participants were low income. And about a third of them were mandated to be there because their kids were involved with DHS, right? So abuse, neglect cases. But another 30-ish were mandated because Sutton also ran a program for young mothers experiencing housing instability. They had a group home. So as a condition of being in the group home, you had to come to parenting class. And another 30% were just there because or 40% were there because it's voluntary. And it varies. So at Morris and Second Chance, there was some consistency throughout the year and who was there. At Sutton, it was 12 classes and then you graduated. So people kind of came and went a little more. Before I go any further, I want to say when I was looking for the programs to study, there were 70. This work was in Philadelphia. There were 70 different programs. So the way that I looked for them was I went to the sort of umbrella organization that funds all these things across the city, and I said, I want programs that are really good, that you feel good about, because I didn't want to study ones that were known to be, not functional. And I wanted to study programs where most of the participants were not mandated to be there because of abuse or neglect, because that just brought in another level of complexity that wasn't really related to my research questions. So these were all 3 well-regarded parenting classes. Any questions about the sites?
So
Yeah.
They strike me as really a different group in certain ways, and not just along the dimensions you just said, but also developmentally. So you have these young,
Yeah.
low-income high school students who are at a different life cycle stage than. So I just wonder how you think about the heterogeneity between the first two and the last.
Totally. So the people that I ended up being most interested in at Sutton were the young mothers who were in the housing program, and they were all, 18, 19, 20. So there ended up being a lot of similarity. I did some interviews with the older parents there, but it was the young mothers that I really focused on, precisely because I was really interested in parents who were sort of just beginning, newer parents. Uh-huh.
The first one, the second one, did people select into it? In other words, you decided you didn't want a GED, you really wanted to finish school.
Yep.
So you selected in, which is, somebody might think they're more motivated than, and somebody, it might be, I'm just saying. But the mix with that, and as you explained, Sutton and the high school, that, so you're talking about young mothers who got first one kid or two kids, right? And they're trying to get some education, at least in two of the groups.
Yep.
In addition to figure out how to parent, and probably has to do with work too.
Mm-hmm.
Probably coming, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that this is a representative sample. Yeah, there's definitely, so at the Second Chance, this was a charter school that provided job training. So the people who were there was certainly at both of these schools a sort of, I want to turn my life around kind of thing, that these are people who had dropped out, who'd been unsuccessful. At Second Chance, it was more explicitly about job training. But at neither school were parents there because they wanted parenting education, right? It was required. At Morris, because if you had your kids in the daycare, it was required. At Second Chance, it was required light, I think, because some parents, I don't think every parent was in it, but some of the parents I interviewed said, I didn't really want to be here, but I have to be. Any other questions about sites? Okay. So when I was doing the data collection, I wanted to get a sense of who the moms were financially, right? So I worked with the mothers to identify the various sources of income and expenses that they had. And so came up with this information sheet. I don't know if the numbers on here are exactly accurate. This is one mother's sheet filled out. But I just share it to say that, here she's saying she needs $400 a month to pay all her expenses, and she's $200 short. That speaks to a very high level of poverty, right? So I don't know if that's completely accurate, or probably varies month to month, but the point here is that a lot of the mothers that I'm talking about were people who were really, really living on the edge. All right. So just another, one more minute on framing. In this paper, I'm drawing from kind of two theoretical constructs. The first I'm thinking folks here are familiar with, which is the work on scarcity and cognitive load, Melanathan and Shafir. Are folks familiar with that? The idea being that when people are in a situation of scarcity, they tunnel and they can only focus on the one resource that they're really struggling with. So that's one concept. And the other is the idea of the hidden curriculum, which is really a classic soc ed concept, which basically says that in addition to the explicit curriculum like math, reading, social studies, schools are socializing agents and they're teaching people other things, particularly through rules, routines, interactions. They teach these kind of, the hidden curriculum is also taught or expressed in what gets counted as worthy of teaching and what doesn't. So what's included in the official curriculum and what is not. So for decades, sociologists of education have argued that the hidden curriculum has a sort of ideological component or can have an ideological component, teaching students to obey authority, to accept kind of existing power arrangements, or adhere to certain values and beliefs like, equality of opportunity or competition. And the hidden curriculum manifests in lots of ways, but here I'm talking about two things that are particularly important. what gets included in the curriculum and what doesn't. And my big argument is poverty doesn't. So that's one way. And then the other way is how instructors guided the conversation when poverty did come up. So those are the two ways that I'm thinking about the hidden curriculum. All right, so let's move to findings. So I was trying to think about like a nice like mnemonic or something to capture my argument. So I was thinking of silence, scarcity, and structure. And by that I mean that in the classes there was really a silence about the topic of poverty. Despite what you saw that mother was dealing with, the classes really didn't talk about it. And it took me a while to even notice this. And it wasn't until I started doing my interviews with the mothers and hearing about what they were dealing with, this extreme scarcity, that I was like, wait a minute. These classes that are meant to be helping them aren't talking about any of the things that the mothers are dealing with. So then I argue that this kind of disconnection ultimately serves to downplay kind of structural analysis of poverty and promote more individualistic understandings, right? Takes a sort of burden off structure and places it on what individuals are or are not doing to help their children. Okay, so just briefly, class content. This was coming out of both the official curriculum as in the curricular materials and also just what got taught. So what I did in my research is I would when I was taking field notes, I'd keep track of the topics that came up, and then I went back and interviewed the instructors and the heads of the agencies and said, here's what I'm seeing. Does this fit with what you think the classes are teaching? There was some differences across the sites. As I said, Mama Odette was much looser. At Sutton Social Services, there was much more emphasis on not hitting kids. But there were generally, these kind of core themes. We want to be positive to kids. We want to say good things. We don't want to be critical. We don't want to use really harsh punishment, both verbal and corporal. We want to let children have emotions and respect them. Children need attention. They need healthy food. And they also emphasized this idea that children were a sponge. So you needed to, as a parent, you needed to see your child as someone who was affected by the things that they saw or heard or experienced. And so you had to be careful of the kind of environments you put them in. So those were the main topics. Any questions about that? Yeah.
So if they had weekly meetings for a school year,
Yeah.
this doesn't seem like much content.
Right. It was so interesting. Yeah. So there wasn't a whole lot of content. I mean, I could go further, like at Second Chance, they did this whole thing on brain development and girls' brains versus boy brains, which I found really mystifying. There was more stuff on like, stages of child development, but not. This is the stuff that all the classes covered. But yeah, there wasn't a ton of content, and it was a lot of kind of discussion, and the classes were less didactic than I thought they would be. Yeah, and there's some real implementation issues with parenting education, right?
Nothing about work-life balance and
Nothing.
the jobs that are available.
Nothing.
At bad times, so it's hard to get childcare.
Nothing.
Anything on mental health? Like
Nothing.
To do or
Well, they would say, look in the mirror and tell yourself you're a queen. They would do that kind of stuff. They would say, tell your children they're wonderful. That stuff. But there was very little on mental health. Nothing about managing stress. Nothing about housing. None of those kinds of things that the moms were dealing with. Mm-hmm.
So would it be fair to say then that the implicit assumption is that all the moms had basic needs met, even though they didn't? The implicit assumption then built into the curriculum is that those things are at a steady state of at least basic capacity. Is that fair?
I don't think so, because when I interviewed the instructors, one of my questions was, what's the biggest challenge the mothers in your classes face? The first thing they all said was poverty. So I don't think so. I think the assumption was that parenting education should focus on parenting behaviors and attitudes, not getting basic needs met. So
Both can be done without.
exactly.
So
Exactly.
that's the implicit, so the implicit assumption was this norm is poverty, that's the steady state, so we don't say it, but.
We should still be able to.
Is what you just said.
Yes, yes, we should still be able to do these things.
I was wondering, I mean, this is just out of curiosity. It seemed like there was, some research finding about a gap in the number of words that.
Yeah.
Was that something that was incorporated, encouraging the child to talk more and?
Some of the classes did a little bit. Like at Sutton, there was a lot about reading to your children and talking to them. Yes, it wasn't. I had thought that it would be more didactic. Like they would be saying, "You need to da 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 da." At Second Chance, they were supposed to spend 15 minutes of quality time a day with their kids, but it was less. It was more sort of not as overt as that. But certainly, that's part of the thinking that informs these programs for sure.
So, this is the content of the curriculum. Can you say a little bit, sort of hinted at it, what the setup was? Because I can
Yeah.
imagine this being basically a support group
Right.
for parenting teams.
Yeah.
And we would view that really differently in terms of the curriculum.
Right.
The point is not the curriculum, it's to get support. So can you say a little bit about
Yeah, I think that they were sort of a mush between a hybrid instead of a mush between a kind of support group and a sort of more didactic situation. Let me go back to the sites. At Morris, the instructor did some kind of talking about what parents should do, but it was sort of like interspersed with the parents asking her questions and her kind of going back and forth. And then sort of towards the end of class, she'd look down and be like, "Oh, here's the handout we're supposed to be talking about. You should, read to your children," or something like that. But they did tend to be structured more like support groups. Second Chance was more, there was more kind of activities. So you'd have, a contest to see who could do the best job of categorizing ages and stages, kind of things like your child can be doing. At what age should your child be able to, be toilet trained, or what age should your child be able to roll over, or whatever. And at Sutton, they were the most support groupy. At Sutton, they always started with a check-in. They would go around and say what they were, what was going on for them that week. So that felt the most support groupy. Yeah. Uh-huh.
All right, one last question. So how does that map onto then, like, the parenting education classes that you mentioned at the beginning? Is that consistent, you think, with, like, so thinking of, like,
Yeah.
Head Start or, like, you mentioned at the beginning, how does that map
Right.
onto that we would expect in those
Right.
two? Or?
So it's really interesting. When I first started the study, I went to the agency and I said, "I want a place that's doing really good parenting class." And they sent me to Sutton. And I was like, great. And then I got into Sutton, and there wasn't the kind of instruction that the literature on parenting education suggested would be there. So I was like, all right. I spent the year at Sutton, and I really, I got into it, but then I thought, this is not right. So let me find some other sites. So I went and got those other two sites, and it still wasn't really happening. So I don't know, I can't speak to it more broadly, but I think that it's hard to sit and tell a parent what to do. So I think that in all the places, people kind of walked back from that completely didactic and tried to make it sort of more collaborative. I also did some research with early Head Start parent visitors. I don't talk about it in this paper, but they would also say the same thing. They would say, you can't really have a one-on-one conversation with a mom and tell them that what they're doing is wrong. So we try to kind of be more soft about it. So it makes me wonder about the fidelity with which programs are implemented. Mm-hmm.
So when they were kind of talking about these are best practices or like these behaviors or what you should be doing, that kind of thing, how would they justify that? Like,
Yeah.
would they usually say this, like would they cite research or would they just kind of say like, I think this is better, or like how was that framed?
It does different people, different places, and different ways and different sites. Sort of, you should read to your kids. Reading is good. We're killing our kids by having them watch TV all the time. Don't hit your kids. It affects their self-confidence. So kind of just very sort of normative rationale, but they weren't saying the evidence is that was not. I did research at programs that serve middle-class moms, and then they did a lot of that. Yeah. Okay. All right, so what I argue here is that the hidden curriculum of the programs was really just that point, that parenting is an individual task and responsibility, and that good parents should be able to do this regardless of their kind of material conditions. And there are two ways that I think this gets communicated, ignoring and reframing. And when I was writing the paper, I struggled with talking about the ignoring or the silence because it's hard to write about something that isn't there. And it wasn't until I really was deep into my analysis and kept looking, I was like, wait, and I would sort of tabulate, keep track of all the topics that came up in each class. Wait, again, here, it's not happening. So, but the one place where this kind of silencing did show up was at Sutton, because, as I said, Sutton classes always started with this check-in. So parents would go around, they'd sit in a circle, very support groupy, they'd sit in a circle and talk about what they had been dealing with that week. And these check-ins would often involve really serious issues. One mother had been walking up and down this kind of main thoroughfare looking for a job and had not been able to find a job. Another mother, several people talked about violence, shootings, violence at their kids' schools. These are, really intense things. And they never got picked up. The instructor would just kind of nod. And there was never an effort to connect them with what the class was doing that day. So for example, one night Taylor, an African-American woman, started by describing her nephew's funeral that had just happened. He had just voted for the first time. He was a young adult, and he was shot in some gang violence. And so she's talking about this, and her voice is breaking, and her eyes are filling up with tears as she describes the funeral and her nephew's young son, who must have been quite young, who didn't realize until the end of the service that it was his father, and tried to throw himself into the casket. I mean, it was really intense. So she's describing this, and Mr. Michael, the instructor, I didn't tell you the instructors at Sutton. Mr. Michael was the instructor at Sutton, and he was a father, African-American man in his 40s. He was a human services professor at a local university, and the other instructor at Sutton was the administrator of the program, also African-American man. So anyway, Mr. Michael, he's looking sympathetic when this woman is talking about this, but he just kind of lets that go, and he doesn't facilitate a conversation about other folks who might have dealt with violence, and all of the mothers had dealt with violence, or how the stress that she was feeling might affect her engagement with her children. Instead, once the check-ins finished, he just moved on to the topic of the class, which was why it was so important to treat your children with affection. Another night, also at Sutton, Charisse, a young mother who was living in a transitional house, used her check-in. This was for mothers experiencing homelessness. She used her check-in to talk about how annoyed she was at the house rules and the ways in which the house mother was not treating her fairly. So Mr. Sean, who's the other instructor but was also the administrator, so here Charisse is kind of venting, and she's saying, it's not fair, and I'm trying to, get my things together, and I can't, she's in my way, and she's not, it's not working. And Mr. Sean is kind of walking by, and he stops, and he kind of does this, and he says, is this a parenting issue? This is not a place for that conversation. This is a parenting class. So in exchanges like this, and in general, this silence about poverty, you can see the instructors drawing boundaries between topics that are appropriate for parenting class, like treating your child with affection, individual behaviors, and topics that aren't, which are, poverty-related challenges. So again, the class is reinforcing this idea that good parenting was independent from material concerns. So the other way in which these kind of messages are sent are through reframing. So what we did in the analysis is we looked at every class in which the mothers themselves raised something to do with living in poverty, whether it was, feeding their children, a welfare issue, housing instability, violence, every time the mothers raised that and then how the instructors responded. And what we found was a consistent pattern of reframing. So they would change the conversation from these kind of structural things to individual traits and behaviors. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. At one second chance class that was focused on discipline, there were about 9 students sitting around, and they were completing a sheet about the families in which they were raised. This class was ultimately teaching them, I don't know if folks are familiar with this, backbone parenting versus jellyfish parenting versus brick wall. You know, it's like authoritarian, permissive, authoritative. Right, there's one that's better, that's the backbone. Right, so this, and that was actually the one thing that stuck with parents. Those comparisons actually were helpful. But so they're learning about this. And the sheet asks them to respond with seldom, sometimes, or frequently to questions like, was communication direct in my family? Or, in my family, the parent has absolute authority. So they're supposed to kind of inventory the families in which they were raised. So then they get to the 3rd item. Disorder and chaos were common in my family. And several people call out frequently. And they're talking about the families in which they were raised. And Shanae, an African-American young mother who wore her hair in these dark, heavy bangs, and she had a super intense expression on her face all the time, she frowned and she said, there are lots of kids in my house. I'd be cussing. People eat my food I put in the fridge. They don't respect nothing. I went to Fridays with my daughter. We didn't eat our food and we brought it home. Someone ate it. My mom said we should have just eaten it there. Okay. So a number of other parents chime in then, talking about their experiences with their food being eaten, with keeping refrigerators locked because they wanted to protect their food, and generally kind of sharing in this sentiment. But the teacher, Miss Naomi, she's having none of this. She responds by saying, families should not be locking up food because we should have more respect. And then she starts telling, and Naomi was from sort of a working class, lower middle class family. And she talks about how her mother would always ask her and her sister what they wanted at the grocery store so they wouldn't argue about food. And another mother chimes in saying, ain't no choosing in my house. Right? Like, that's not something that's happening in my house. And Miss Naomi, again, doesn't really address this. Instead, she keeps saying, you got to have respect. We have to have respect for people. So I thought this exchange and others like this are really revealing, because what Shanae is describing and the other mothers are situations in which you have overcrowding, and so you can't maintain clear boundaries, or you have homes where the access to food is just so limited that there's conflict about food. And these are situations that aren't uncommon in poor households, right? But Miss Naomi's not empathizing with them. She's not even seeming to understand it or talking about how they could handle these conflicts. Instead, she's kind of reframing it and making it, shifting the focus away from these kind of big picture structural issues to individual behavior, right? Respect. So she's suggesting that if people just treated one another differently, conflicts over food would disappear. There's another example from Sutton. This was a December night, and it was sort of right before the holiday party, and there were 10 parents in the room, and they were kind of laughing and joking about the upcoming holiday celebration. And they had started reviewing this document the week before, which was about resources in children's lives. And the resources were things like support from families, reading for pleasure. I don't really understand what this document was, but it was like a long list of things. And so they had started the week before, and they were on number 35. So we've been doing this for a long time. They would read it and then discuss each one. So they get to number 35, which is resistance skills. Young person can resist negative peer pressure and dangerous situations. So one mother, so this is a resource that they're all supposed to agree with. That would be a good thing. Again, I don't really understand the assumption, but this was what was happening. So one mother immediately objected, saying with an earnest look on her face, lots of them can't. Their pride is on the line. So this is in Philadelphia. It's a pretty violent, dangerous city. So she's basically saying that if you look like you're going to step back from conflict, that can actually make you vulnerable, right? You can be more vulnerable to assault if you look like you're not willing to protect yourself. So she says this, And Mr. Sean says, there's always the pull of peer pressure. It depends on their attachment to their family. When kids feel love, they can resist the brother on the corner. We got to make our kids feel like they're part of something. So Tina is a mother who was there voluntarily, and her older son was in prison. And she raises her hand, and she's like, but they don't call on her, and instead the other instructor speaks up, and he says, kids need to feel attachment, love. If they don't feel a part of a loving family unit, the likelihood is that they'll go the wrong way. So now Tina's like, what? So she shakes her head and she bursts out, that's not true. My son had everything he needed, and he still went the wrong way. She's looking really upset. And then she looks around to the instructors trying to get some affirmation. But she doesn't get any. And actually another mother says to her, yeah, that was his choice, not your fault, you know. And she sort of seems to feel a little bit better from that. But the instructors never acknowledge this. So what they're doing here is they're placing the blame for youth violence and crime at the feet of the parents. Their analysis is individually focused. It's not acknowledging, you know, what we all know about neighborhood variation in mobility, in opportunities for mobility, exposure to violence, racial discriminations in employment, criminal justice, other domains, right? They're not acknowledging any of this. Instead, they're saying that youth become involved in crime because of what's going on at home. So these instances of reframing, combined with this silence on poverty, on structural issues, ultimately then foregrounded individual responsibility and downplayed the impact of poverty. And this is despite the fact that poverty was really central to the mother's experiences. So I want to share some of the information that I got from mothers about the ways poverty affected their lives, to kind of contextualize this and highlight the disconnection. And just to start, Philadelphia is one of the poorest big cities in the country. And so to the mothers, good parenting, and poverty rates are incredibly high. I think it's got the highest rate of deep poverty in the country. So to the mothers, good parenting was really about being able to provide for their kids. And I wasn't aware of this until I had the interviews, right, with the mothers, because again, it didn't come up in the classes. But in the interviews, the moms talked a lot about running out of food at the end of the month, feeding their kids cereal, noodles, rice with gravy, things that would kind of last them through, because they just didn't have enough money. So one of the most poignant examples comes from Sutton, and I'm going to do a little more reading here because I want you to get the sort of ethnographic feel. So at Sutton, Jen was a white woman who, I think I mentioned her earlier, was really struggling with being unable to find a job. She was in her 30s. She was overcoming drug addiction and had given birth to a daughter with severe health issues because she was addicted to drugs. So she was using drugs when she was pregnant. And she was usually a pretty eager participant in parenting class. She was in like a 12-step program. She was doing all of these things, and she was pretty into the whole turn your life around thing. But one March night, she was really distracted, and she had her daughter with her, and she was trying to give her a bottle. Her daughter was maybe she was born premature. She was maybe 3 months old, but she was teeny. And she's holding her and crooning quietly, but something's going on. The baby's not able to drink. And she gets really agitated. And I was sitting there watching. I was sitting next to her, and I was watching this, and you could see her body get hunched. She was getting nervous. And she gestures to another mother, and they step out, and they go, I don't know where. And they move quietly because they didn't want to interrupt the conversation that the instructor was leading about temper tantrums. Okay. So they go out, they come back a couple minutes later, and Jen sits back down holding her baby, and she's hunched over her, and the baby's obviously still struggling. So this goes on. And I'm getting increasingly distracted, what's going on here? Finally, the class breaks for dinner, and she explains to people sitting near her that she had a new slow flow bottle. Are people familiar with this? Because her daughter had reflux, and she had mixed cereal with the formula, and it was clogging the nipple. It wasn't going through. So I said, well, just rinse out the bottle and start again. Just use some fresh formula, no cereal. Well, that was all the formula Jen had. She didn't have any money to buy more, and it was her only bottle. And what she had done when she left, she and the other mother had gone to the bathroom to try to like poke a bigger hole in the bottle, but it hadn't worked. So then Mr. Sean, the instructor, and I get involved, and we're like shaking the bottle and trying to get something to come out, but it doesn't work. And Jen is getting more and more frustrated because here's her baby. She literally can't feed her baby. And she says, I just bought this bottle for $10 at Babies R Us. The poor baby is so hungry. The baby hasn't eaten in hours, she said, and she's really panicking. I'm about to throw this bottle out the window. Finally, and I can't remember how, she and it somehow wasn't in my notes, but she got another bottle, and she was able to switch the tops. And so then she tries again, and she holds her bottle, and you could just like watch her body relax, right? As the baby starts drinking, you could hear the regular clicks of a baby drinking. So this was super intense. But the important point here is not just that she was struggling to feed the baby, but also that her struggle to do so was an aside. That she was trying to do it without interrupting class. That the instructor, even though she was obviously in distress, only got involved on the break. And that the group never talked about how scary it was not to be able to feed your baby, not to have food for your children. Because this was a class on temper tantrums, and that was taking precedence. So that's one example of how much the mothers struggled with these kind of basic needs. The mothers also struggled with housing. It was an issue for a lot of mothers. So for example, Bernice was a 19-year-old African-American mother. She was a student at Second Chance. And in her first interview, I was asking her about her living situation. She said, well, I was moving back and forth from my godmom's house, and then I moved back to my mom's house, and then I met my son's father. I was living with him and his family, and then I went back because then he got incarcerated. So she's like describing all this serious housing instability. A year later, when I interviewed her again, she was one of the mothers I was able to keep in touch with. She and her son had moved to a rented room. So they had their own home, and she was really excited about that. But the room was completely infested with mice. So much so that, when she was talking about it, her whole face crinkled with disgust when she talked about the mice getting in her food. And she was saying, she put the bread on a shelf, they would get into it, so she tried a higher shelf, and they'd get into it, and she kept trying to move the food so the mice didn't get into it. So, finding safe, sanitary living spaces were hard. Other parents faced constant threats of eviction from landlords or families. If you're living with your grandmother or aunt and she gets sick of you, she can put you out. So Kaylee was a white mother at Morris of 2 children. She was about 20 at the time of her second interview. And she moved out of her mother's house because she had so many conflicts with family members there. And ultimately, she had dropped out of Morris. She said, I didn't really have a place I was staying and stuff, nowhere. So those are just some examples of the kinds of struggles that the moms faced with housing. Finally, there were a lot of worries about keeping children safe. Again, Philadelphia is a dangerous city, lots of concerns about street violence, people saying, I can't take my kid to that park because that's where someone I know got shot, or I won't go to that neighborhood, or I keep my door, I stay in, I don't let my kids play outside. So there was a lot of concern about just kids being kind of caught up in the violence. And then parents also feared that their kids would later be drawn into what they called the drama of street life. So here's Charisse again. She was an African-American mother at Sutton, and she was living in the transitional housing program, and she had an infant son, Tariq. And she, in our interview, she said she really wanted to keep him out of trouble. So in our interview, she said, so with the gangs and stabbings and the shootings and things like that, nobody cares for you or your kid. Nobody cares. So I fear those things for Tariq every day. Those things be working, they work on my mind. So this issue of worries about survival preoccupying parents is an important one. And here's where we get back to the work on scarcity.
You're describing a typical life of low-income people.
Yeah.
The only point we haven't yet, the MDRC summary says, very interesting, that kids won't ask their parents for things because they know their parents can't give them.
Yeah.
Okay? So these are the issues.
Mm-hmm.
But, in the saw.
Yeah. It's frustrating. It's frustrating to think about that. Yeah. So, we know that the scarcity is shaping people's lives, and we know that when people are in situations of scarcity, they tunnel. They only focus on the thing that's scarce. And so this was a big issue for the moms, and I think it's one of the reasons why, or could be, I can't prove this, but it could be one of the reasons why parenting classes haven't been as effective. So actually the research is the folks who benefit the least from parenting education programs are the ones who might need it the most. So the very poorest mothers, young mothers are the ones who tend to get the least out of it. So when I would talk to them about, how did this affect, how did living in this kind of poverty affect your parenting, they would often talk about being so preoccupied that they would be short-tempered with their kids. So Brianna was an African-American mother at Sutton, and in our first interview, this was at the beginning of my research, before I really even knew what I was going to find or what I was doing, and I started out and I was like, okay, you're taking parenting. What do you hope to get out of this? I said, what skills or knowledge do you want to get? And she just looked at me and she was like, no, I wish I could provide better. That's it. I just need a job. I need to get a job. So then, so that was her concern, right? She wasn't worried about learning to talk to her children in a particular way. When I interviewed her again several months later, she had gotten a job at a fast food restaurant, so some of the stress was relieved. And then she was able to talk about how it affected her relationship with her son. One of the things that's interesting is when the mothers were in the deepest stress, and I would say, how does this affect you? They'd all say, I'm fine. Right? It wasn't until after, in the second interview, when often things had gotten a little better, that they could sort of be more reflective about it. So she said that she would yell at her son a lot. I'd get frustrated quick. I would just make him sit down and I just want you to watch TV. Just sit down while I think. So you could see that this focus on survival was taking precedence over everything else. Not surprising. Tanaya was a second chance mother, and she was similarly worried constantly about making ends meet. She had 2 young children. They lived on less than $1,000 each month, a combination of salary from a part-time job and public assistance, including food stamps. She paid over $400 in rent. She didn't have a whole lot left. So in an interview, her brow creased as she talked about how this affected her. She said, I got to figure out how I'm going to spread all the money out to make sure we're stable or whatever. She's the one who said, I don't run out of money at the end of the month, I run out at the middle of the month. She said, I get stressed all the time. Money is always on my mind. So I said, well, how did this affect your parenting? And she said she would just get immobilized by the anxiety. So she was actually one who did talk about it in the moment. She said, I just sit there by myself and I'll tell them to do everything, like make something to eat or wash up. So this was really intense for the moms. So the other thing that I learned, again not surprising, is that the mothers didn't actually think that they got very much out of the parenting classes. And again, my study is not saying that I can assess the impact, because it's often, I was interested in what the mothers said, and you may learn something and not be able to, not be conscious of it. So that is possible. But when I asked the mothers about what they learned, what they got out of the class, how it changed them, they were pretty clear that it had minimal effect, except they did remember the backbone, brick wall, jellyfish. But so I would say, how did you benefit? What did the class do for you? What did you learn? And they would kind of shake their hands and say, nothing. I didn't learn anything. And I'd say, well, is there anything, and I asked this 50 times in my interviews, is there anything that you might do differently because of the classes? And they'd say, no, the same. And then I was like, okay. So my interviews, I kept trying to get at this. And I thought, all right, well, maybe they can't say how they personally were affected, but maybe if I can understand what they thought the classes were teaching, that might give me a sense of how they were affected, right? So I would ask them, well, what do you think the goals of the classes were? What were the classes teaching? And they would say, they were trying to make us better parents. I'd say, okay, what do you mean? What does better parents look like? And they would say, no, just better parents. So they were not even able to give any kind of concrete information that the classes had taught them. Part of it was that they weren't very didactic, and part of it was, I think, this thing. They just it wasn't registering for them. So, and this was, when I did the follow-up interviews, this was really apparent. So Taisha was a mother I interviewed a year after the class, and she said, it's gone from my head now, because I have a lot of other stuff to worry about, and I'm really going through the challenges of the real world, like how it really is, the struggling part. So I don't really think about it that much. So for Taisha and the other mothers, the challenges of day-to-day survival, not surprisingly, really took precedence over what it was the classes were teaching. So in conclusion, I want to just note that there's some limitations to this work. I certainly can't speak to all programs, right? Although I did try to get more variation. And it could be that there are other programs that are doing a better job of meeting mothers' needs. Although again, I tried to get ones that were seen as effective. Another limitation is that I did not do home observations with the mothers. I had planned to, and I didn't, and I can talk about why. And so I didn't get to really understand what they were doing at home. So that's another limitation. I also want to add a caveat that I'm not saying that parenting education is bad. And I'm certainly not saying that the people who were running these programs and teaching the programs weren't really well-intentioned. I think they were. But just that this disconnection between the classes and the parents' lives was really profound, and it didn't serve the mothers. So I want to end with a few takeaways. The first is that this hidden curriculum, whether intentional or not, really did promote individual understandings of poverty. And I think that this helps us understand, that the disconnection helps us understand why the programs aren't as effective as as people hope they would be. I think there's some ways to think about using this information to think about how to design better parenting classes. So for instance, you can imagine a class that talks about, how do you feed children inexpensively, right? How do you, if you've got a lot of housing instability, how do you help your children feel secure and safe when they're moving in and out of shelters? How do you deal with stress? How do you deal with negotiating with the non-custodial parent? Like all these things that were really real in parents' lives, they weren't addressed, but they could be. They could be. And that, I think, would make the programs more helpful. Parenting education programs, to kind of take a step back, I think really exemplify this tendency in U.S. social policy to educationalize social problems, right? We have a problem, poverty, drug abuse, unemployment, and we try to teach people things, to teach them to behave differently or think differently with the assumption that that will solve the problem rather than, addressing things like growing a safety net or reducing inequality. And I think these programs exemplify that, and they also exemplify the limitations of that approach. So I think ultimately they really speak to the value of more direct supports for poor mothers. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any more questions. Yeah.
Two questions. One is, I'd love to hear, and it may not just have been in this paper, sort of what you felt like you learned from talking to the instructors.
Yeah.
I guess the second question, did you get a sense, or, and I realize you probably don't have evidence on this, is it the idea that they promote individualism because otherwise they worry that the moms will just think there's nothing they could do to improve their lives, right? There's this notion that if we tell them how bad things, like if we go into the structural issues, then they'll just feel hopeless and helpless.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that, people think a million things at the same time, right? So I would interview the instructors, and they would say the biggest problem was poverty. Then they'd also say they want to interrupt the cycle of poverty, and then they'd also talk about all the things the poor parents were doing wrong. So part of me thought that there was something about the very endeavor of parenting education that kind of funneled the conversation towards this more individual analysis. So I think that's part of it. I also think that there was this kind of self-help thing going on, so that you really they were trying to motivate the parents to get them to kind of take control of their lives. So I think that those were two pieces going on. I do know that like one of the instructors, Mama Odette, I would talk to after the class, and she would say things like, these moms, one of the things they really need help with is co-parenting with the dads who are not living with them. She said, I'm going to do something on that. But she never did. She would also say, these moms really need to learn how to eat healthy. So she would tell them, I'm going to bring in salads for you. But she never did. So I don't completely know what that was about. And it was a hard thing to interview people about without really making them get very defensive about what they were doing. So I kind of tried to get sideways on it, but I never said to them, why don't you actually teach the parents anything about how to survive poverty? I never asked that. Now, maybe I could have, and maybe I should have, but yeah, I don't know quite what it was. It was almost like it was like a paradigm. Like this was the paradigm they were in. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just to get a sense of the trade-offs, like when you're talking about the value of direct supports, about how much do these programs cost to run?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the specifics of how much the programs cost to run. I mean, I know, it was, and the funding is complicated because it came from DHS and then it went through this agency and this agency and this agency. But I know, like the stuff that I found on sort of national spending is it's a lot of money that's getting spent, like hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah, and I don't think it's a waste of money. I think that we do want to support poor moms in lots of different ways. So I don't think it's a waste of money. I just think that it's not, that there are much more effective ways to do this and that it needs to be done more carefully so that it doesn't end up doing more harm than good. Yeah.
Would you, so as you said that, I was just wondering if the teachers are coming through, and maybe some of the things that, the broader aspects, like, like you talk about that list of the main things that were brought up. I'm just wondering if just as a thought, like if that was like, maybe it could be something that happened, is there was some idea of what they wanted to do, but just because just really reaching to the part of practice through some of the messages were coming through. And also, like, those are some of the teachers that just wanted to know, like, how long were they there for? Was there like a turnover? Like, just wondering.
Right.
That structure.
I mean, so the agency that funded parenting education in the city, I had their RFPs, and so one of the things that they asked for was they would only use curricula that had 12-week kind of cycles and that were research-based. But they didn't, the curricula were not followed with any degree of fidelity. So that's one. The instructors were all folks who'd had a lot of experience teaching parenting education. Yeah.
It sounds like all these programs were very targeted at mothers.
Yes.
But it's called parenting.
Yes.
Is there a fathering or parenting? Are there any equivalent programs that are targeted more?
Oh, for sure there are.
And, like
In these settings? No. Not that I studied. Now, there were some dads like who would come and go, but the most consistent participants were mothers. I did interview one father who was a consistent participant, but he came with his wife. Yeah, but there's a whole other world of fatherhood programs. Yeah.
So I was actually going to speak to that. I've done some evaluation of a fatherhood
Mm-hmm.
program that follows the model that Phil and Carolyn Cowan developed of targeting co-parenting relationships as part of fatherhood programs. And so they have employment referrals, and an employment program and mental health referrals and things like that. So and talk about budgeting.
Yeah.
The focus groups I've done with, it's all low-income parents. The parents the parenting materials really resonate with them very strongly, and led them to think a lot about their childhoods and how they want to parent their children differently from how they were parented and be able to express emotion, things like that. So maybe in the presence of addressing some of those things.
I think that's
but
right.
The other things that sort of struck me is I know the curriculum and the implementation in that setting, they talk about issues like working alliance
Working alliance between who, the instructors and
educators and
Mhm.
the reaction we were hearing, at least from Ms. Naomi and Mr. Sean, is not something that would promote working alliance, right? So thinking about just those kind of
Yeah.
dynamics. And then the other thing to kind of get back to what Catherine was raising about, how do you talk about these as sort of structural
Mhm.
issues without being like, so your life is terrible.
Right.
Have a good week.
You've got no hope. Yeah. Right.
There are no jobs for people.
So, there's that issue, and then on the other side, one of the things that I kind of struggle with thinking through these things is we are in an individualistic culture.
Right.
And so if we're going to meet people where they are in a place of individualism. And so you can kind of respect them culturally by accepting that individualistic framework, or you can reject their culture and propose a more structural explanation. Like I think it seems not entirely straightforward to just say, here's an alternative way of viewing the situation because people are individualistic.
Well, I think it depends on whose culture we're talking about. Like, the things that the mothers would say that they got out of the classes, some of the mothers would talk about appreciating the opportunity to share with people to get some sort of social support. So I think that they value that. But when I did ask moms what they thought parenting classes should do, they would talk about things like, oh, the classes should have baby showers. Wanting to kind of create that would be something that would be helpful. I think both because people need stuff and also because they wanted to kind of create more of a community. So I don't know I don't know that I would agree that because we live in an individualistic culture, we shouldn't that we should go along with it when we're thinking about poverty interventions, because I'm not sure.
I'm not saying that we should, I'm just saying it's less straightforward.
Yes.
Because, often when we go into a new culture, we say, right, to a different country, we're like, we need to appreciate the
Right.
culture.
Right.
So, I think there's
Yeah.
some less straightforward
Sure.
proposal.
Sure.
And I think there actually sort of what you were saying about help them figure out ways to stretch money in
Yeah.
a healthy way on a budget. It's still individualistic.
Right. It's not saying, fight the power.
Right. So so it's interesting to me that I think even within an individualistic paradigm, you could tackle the issues around poverty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is the individual reality that the clients are serving.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Try and assess
Right.
assess their situation.
Right.
And see what you suggested. Again, what can be done.
Right.
And what can be done, I think, is $200 a month child allowance.
Yeah.
I've seen that before. So,
I agree.
Did the school have social workers that were supposed to be helping them with basic needs? I mean, that's the other thing that occurs to me, is that there might have been some other mechanism at the school for that's supposed to be taking care of housing instability or...
I don't think they had any help with housing instability. There was, the schools had clothes closets where students could come and get clothes or coats. If they did enough parenting classes, they would get something called, I can't remember what it was called, but it was like the parenting partnership program that ran Morris and Second Chance. They had bucks. I can't remember, it was parenting bucks, or there was some other baby bucks. I can't remember what it was. And you could take that and go to their office and shop, and you could get diapers and formula and Halloween costumes. So there was some of that, but it was fairly disconnected. In the schools, both of them served poor kids, and so there was stuff there. I'm sure there was mental health stuff there. I don't know, and there was certainly job training and sort of intervention at Second Chance, but I don't think that I didn't hear any of the mothers talking about the school as a site that was helping them deal with their problems.
Any other questions? Well,
Thank you so much.